Tere hommikust!
Good morning. And I would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity. I thank the Integration Foundation for being able to present here at this integration conference. Well, I must confess that it's been some time since I've been participating in discussions on integration. Well, I have been, as mentioned, a professor of comparative politics at the University of Tartu. And since March 2020, March 2020, I arrived in Flensburg. And I was ready to direct the new institute, the European Center for Minority Issues. I took this journey because it made me go back to the topic that first inspired me to pursue an academic career. This topic is ethnic relations and ethnopolitics. And this change has brought me back to the work that I did here in Estonia in the 90s, when I was advisor to the president of Estonia, and I also chaired the Presidential Roundtable on National Minorities. And this also reminded me of the cooperation that we had with the such famous researchers as Raivo Vettik, Alexander Tussmann, Marju Lauristin, Andra Veidemann, Katrin Saks. These were times when we drafted the first integration program, and we laid the basis for it, and we also served on the board of the Integration Foundation. Well, I mention all these facts not because I'm being nostalgic, but I would like to stress the fact that by now, more than a quarter of a century of this discussion on integration has gone by, and we asked what are the challenges, what are the needs, the requirements. We also have discussed how this relates to European integration, European norms, and we have obviously become a member of the EU since then. And on this journey, there have been many stages of development. We know that there have been positive, negative stages. There have been some setbacks. And I think that we need to remember how some of these issues still come up over and over. So there is a need to adapt to new challenges like we did yesterday. It's also important to remember those debates that we have had. And some of those discussions on ethnic relations, they will not go away for several more decades still. Well, this morning we focus on integration, and by this we mean ethnic integration, diversity management. This is the expression in English. And social cohesion. However, each country faces these challenges in a different way. So how one country, nation should come together, it varies, because we know that such integration, it will take place according to the historical circumstances, depending on which ethno-cultural groups have been where, since when, and in what magnitude. So in other words, what we talk about as diversity management, for example, in Switzerland, it is different from how we see it in Finland or Portugal. At the same time, there are agreed norms that derive from human rights, and they speak to a more universal aim to respect, value, and even protect diversity in the society. These three words are important because they represent degrees of responsibility. If we respect something, then this should lead to valuing it, and ultimately it should lead to protecting it. And this increase in the norms is something that is in the spirit of international and European values. These are principles that we shouldn't lose in the ever-growing perception of geopolitical conflict and the black and white nature of times. Today, something that is stressed is that we need moral clarity. This is a phrase that is proclaimed in Europe and at international events, and it makes sense because when we denounce blatant violations of human rights or international law, Russia's aggression against Ukraine is one such example. But moral clarity cannot be a categorical imperative across everything, not least when some version of it is declared a societal norm for everyone, and in particular when it's enforced by the government. What I see is that this backward notion that started from a call to take sides, and this again can generate an increasing degree of intolerance towards difference and then an urge to eliminate this diversity. The requirement for everything to converge around a single societal model is present, but it is particularly accentuated at difficult times, and we must be careful that we don't lose sight of the core values of Europe, respecting, valuing, and even promoting diversity. In this respect, I have been following the most important integration-related reform in Estonia, and this has to do with a gradual phasing out of Russian language instruction in Estonian schools. And as many know, this is a similar reform in Latvia. I will refer to this again. So it would appear that this is a widespread process. Yet, the degree to which these policies have been approved so quickly in the wake of Russia's war against Ukraine, this indicates how the imperative for moral clarity and to choose sides has had greater reverberations than simply with the realm of defense and security policy. These reforms hint at a profound shift in the ethnic policies in these countries, and this is a major change in our integration policy. There are many aspects in the education reform which we can debate on. The scope of the reform, the pace of the reform, the amount of resources devoted to the reform, the geographical and regional implications of the reform, the implications of the reform on learning and the impact of the reform on schools. If we think about where there will be parallel language environments, one language spoken in the classroom, the other one outside the classroom. But at this point, I would like to focus on the reform and what it implies to integration. So there's been a long debate what integration means in the Estonian context. Who must integrate with who, how much, by when, and how. So this debate has shifted over time, ranging from an accommodation of different ethnic communities and their different contexts to a view which is uniform of integration that is focused on an Estonian nation state. The Estonian policy has also shifted over these years. Well, predominantly it has shifted towards a more stringent nation state position. And this is the reform of the education, that we want to develop a clearer degree of uniformity across the society by discontinuing Russian language education. And there are many ways in which this shift has been viewed. It speaks of building a common space in our Estonian society. It is a way of associating getting better life chances. It is also depicted as ending division and segregation in the society. But unity is again a step towards uniformity. So there are challenges with this search for an integrated society, and this undercuts the degree of diversity and opportunity for minorities in society. Minorities, they shouldn't be seen as a problem that needs to be solved. Minority language and education shouldn't be seen as a problem of the minority itself. The opinion that if you want to be a minority, it's your own business or it's your own fault. And this is not a position that is in conformity with European legal norms and values. Well, I'm not here to argue for segregated societies in the name of minority rights, fragmented or segregated societies, but this is to recognize that the stance towards integration that is implied by the current educational reform is the one that does marginalize the minority identity. So it's seen as a private and individual matter. A minority cannot expect support or rights from the state or from the society for the preservation of their identity. It is up to them how to manage those issues on their own. An educational system that is overwhelmingly oriented towards instruction in a single language with little consideration or planning for how minority language and education might not be tolerated, but also valued and supported, is the one that may be called integration. But this is a very unidirectional model that speaks to a more uniform model of an Estonian society than might be the norm in Europe. And this is where the education reform is moving. There are arguments that favor a more unifying stance. Well, Estonia is a small nation, and we cannot be expected to be responsible for the same kind of cultural diversity promotion as other larger countries. Estonia needs to be protected, almost like a sort of a reservation, since, we have a lot to do with our own language and cultural preservation. So this is a fair argument, although it does pose the situation as being either or. So this still positions the minorities, who are still members of our society, as a problem until they conform to a certain standard. And in the given instance, this standard becomes one where being able to retain minority identity and life is seen problematic. A second argument in favor of the reform relates sadly to the geopolitical situation. And the reason that Russian language education can no longer be tolerated or sustained is that Russian language is the one linked to an aggressive state. It is, so to say, a security risk. It cannot be sustained to the extent that it might divide the society or generate questionable or problematical political views. And in Estonia and Latvia, must move away from anything linked to Russia and should use this context of the European Union. So instead of teaching Russian, teach European languages. And, this would be a sort of a contribution to European side. Well, it goes without saying that the geopolitical arguments are rarely congruent with more universally human rights law and minority rights norms. Is it possible to keep geopolitics from affecting minority rights? Well, ideally, human and minority rights were meant to relieve geopolitical conflict. And that's why we have all these institutions. And this system of norms has failed us when one country decides to brazenly invade another and justifies it, at least in part, on the basis of alleged minority rights violations. Should this mean that geopolitics trumps minority rights? Well, I would maintain that this would be a betrayal of the values that Europe and Estonia have stood for. And therefore we must do so that these values remain standing and that we should abide by them as much as we can. Our panel is meant as a comparative look at diversity management in Europe. So let me open that perspective by comparing Estonia to Latvia. I already noted that Latvia is equally implementing an extensive education reform. I have been following it very closely. But there are some differences in Latvia. So the pace in Latvia is faster. They do it in 3 years. They have fewer resources planned. They have fewer provisions for any kind of supported minority language. The regulation is more intrusive, and even for private schools. So all of these are making the Latvian education reform even more complicated. In Latvia, they have actually attempted this reform previously in 2003 and 4 and in 2018 and 19. And in both cases, there were demonstrations on streets, and some are still ongoing, although less extensive. But with each reform attempt, we see that the very typical political problems come up where the reform ends up being driven by political impulses instead of sound policy. And this leads in turn to resistance and controversy and confusion and a decline in the credibility of government action and policy systems. And we view a range of problems that we also have come across in Estonia, so that we don't take into account the children who don't have sufficient language skills in Latvian or Estonian. The recruitment of new teachers is chaotic and insufficient, and there are regional differences as well that should be taken into account. I'd also like to say that Latvia has been the country to face scrutiny internationally more than Estonia. There have been visits by the Council of Europe, the Venice Commission, that has already assessed a previous attempt in 2018, 2019. In Estonia, this has been seen as positive because the Council of Europe, Venice Commission, they approved the reform, but there's also been some criticism on how the language studies have been introduced in kindergartens and preschools. Because European norms, they state that minority language instruction should be offered at the ages when the child is small. So there are a number of issues, and there are European legal norms. You know about the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities and their recommendations on minority languages and education, the Hague recommendations. These all speak of principles of minority education, and policies should take this into account instead of looking for loopholes or gaps or escapes in international law. I know that my time is running, but I would just like to mention that in Latvia there are some other political moments that should be considered, and our media has also discussed it in Estonia, that the long-term residents in Latvia who are originally from Russia need to take a language test, and that this might take to people being expelled from Russia, sent out from the country because they haven't got the language competence, hence they cannot get the citizenship. And this is another important development. So Latvia has also discussed to totally get rid of Russian-speaking media. And the parliament has also approved this, that there will be no public broadcasting in Russian. So in Estonia, we have ETV Plus and Radio 4, which have been hailed as an essential weapon in the war against misinformation and propaganda. And in Latvia, the authorities appear to believe that their best path forward is that everyone can understand Latvian language. So there are some other issues. But coming to where I am currently based, the German-Danish border region, Flensburg, and the center of minority issues. It was founded in 1996 with a mandate to study majority-minority accommodation challenges in the European perspective, but with a knowledge of the lessons to be learned from the successful best practices, because this is a region where in the 19th century there was the two sides didn't get along, Germans, Danes, Germany and Denmark. And I'm not going to give you a history lecture here. And obviously we cannot adapt and transfer everything, because there are two minorities on both sides of the border, and both states are interested in finding solutions because they have all at stakes there, things at stake. So I would also like to stress the education policy of the region that supports minority languages, starting from kindergartens all the way through the different school levels. And this means that the students, pupils, they are able to communicate both in German and in Danish, no matter what their background is. So language instruction is offered in the minority language and also in the official language. And if you have any questions or if you're interested in this, then please don't hesitate to contact me, because we have programs that enable you to come so in Schleswig-Holstein and southern Denmark and get introduced to these education models. So my message is that after many years of trying to reorient the Russian language education, but this model has sort of been taken over by the geopolitical situation, and this makes the transition more and more important so that we have a cohesive society, and we are moving further away from the three principles I cited earlier. The reforms, they have little to do with promotion of diversity. They don't value minority identities, and they're only contingently linked to tolerance. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Pettai. Forever, but unfortunately our time is limited. And I urge all of you to use this opportunity and ask questions from Professor Pettai. And yes, do we have any questions in the audience right now? Yeah.
Hi, good morning. My name is Eleonora Lotti, and I work for the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities that Professor Pettai mentioned. We are good partners. Thank you very much for raising very sensitive yet topical questions related especially to the Baltic states. Indeed, also, we as an office have been following these various policy reforms in Estonia, but also in Latvia. Namely also the education reform that is taking place right now. I also personally cover Ukraine, so it was interesting to hear your reference to that. And my question to you is the following. You mentioned that indeed the Russian Federation, when it invaded Ukraine, as we all know, basically appealed to alleged violations of minority rights as a pretext, let's say. So the question is, what is the risk of external political manipulation related to the policies that are being adopted right now? Is there a risk that they will be instrumentalized? And so this could create basically a risk, a security risk, instead of actually enhancing national security, as this seems to be the stated goal of some of these processes that are ongoing. So thank you.
Okay, so answer from here. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to recall that at last year's integration conference, we had the presence of the High Commissioner here. That was very lovely. Indeed, you pose an equally direct and sensitive question. Thank you for that. And I think that it is difficult to predict any kind of policy or action by the Russian Federation, as we know, as of February 2022. And in that regard, it is frequently said that, indeed, there's nothing we could do to reckon with what Russia would do anyways. This is a little bit of a fatalistic reference sometimes, but I think that to the extent that it is in the power of governments in the Baltic states to indeed reflect on the moves that they're making, then it is welcome to do so. And I think to answer concretely a question, I think it's important to also think about which steps are being taken. If I were to answer very concretely, I think the question of ending, for instance, public broadcasting in minority languages is probably the most undermining of that situation, because it indeed opens even more the floodgates to all kinds of information risks, which then in turn become security risks, and finally could even become military risks. So in that respect, I'm problematic with that, but I think also, even on the level of educational reform, we must make sure that this does not lead to not only individual, let's say, disenchantment, but also real social consequences if we think about educational outcomes in the future. And if we speak, on the one hand, about increased educational or life opportunities through knowledge of state language, we may actually be generating decreased life chances because pupils are not properly integrated into that new system and are required to repeat classes, are stigmatized, and those issues. I'm not saying that this is going to be a universal problem, but we see that this is not going to be one smooth transition, and there are a host of devils in the details.
Thank you very much, Professor Pettai, for your strong ideas and for your highly interesting presentation.